Would you like to start us with a prayer?
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. O Lord, as we begin to share these thoughts on global healing, we ask, O Lord, that the Holy Spirit guide us through this process so that we may be able to share what we think is the truth, and that it would bring about a greater understanding about the world in which we live. It's so often said, you must be the change you want to see in the world. But now, oh God, we place all of these thoughts in your hands and leave them at your feet. Amen.
Amen. So we are talking about global healing, and what is it that led you to write this book?
Cynthia, when I got down to work on this book, Global Healing, sometime in February, there was a sense of waking up from a troubled night's dream. You know, the abatement of the turbulence that COVID-19 brought in its sweep also, I think, brought about an emotion that can best be analogized with the aftermath of a war. In a news report released in January, the International Labour Organization said it was projecting a deficit in hours worked globally equivalent to 52 million jobs. A deficit of 52 million jobs. So, and global unemployment is now somewhere at about 207 million. But this book does not dwell really on how the world is going to confront that challenge. I mean, let's leave the unraveling of these knots, I think, to the wisdom and intellect of economists, market analysts, and industrialists. So instead, this work seeks to present the conundrums that a changing world will confront increasingly in the future. I'm talking about poverty, migration and refugees, race and religion, the threat of war, and national morality. These are all troubles, nothing new, but I present them alongside new thoughts on addressing the challenge they come with, you know. You see, the irony of it all is that while we can now split the atom, design artificial intelligence to replicate human behavior, make excursions into space, and even speak with hubris about science's pursuit to put an end to death, we have yet not grasped the secret of making peace with one another. We turn to weapons to do the contrary and strut around feigning to belong to an elitist civilization. What do we see on TV screens of blood and destruction? Hate-inspired tragedies, immoral actions. So this book examines the challenges that stand in the way of world progress and threaten the decent survival of the human race. Let's talk about poverty. And Cynthia, please feel to stop me at any time you want to.
Okay.
If I'm not being clear about something, or want a newer perspective on it, or whatever. So a wind of change may have swept across the world in the last 3 decades. You know, by the end of the 1980s, the communist ideology was fast losing its appeal across the former Soviet Union. And Mikhail Gorbachev opened its windows on the world, making perestroika and glasnost the catchwords for a new world. The domino effect was felt across East Europe among former Soviet satellites. The Berlin Wall fell and borders opened for most countries around the world. So world leaders began to speak of a new world order,
Mm-hmm.
neglecting the fact that at the time, three-fourths of the human race were stuck in a mess, driven by poverty, civil strife, and hopelessness.
Mm.
Three-fourths of the human race in the 1980s. Of course, times are somewhat different today. In the last decade or thereabouts, we have seen evidence of a growth in literacy and a simultaneous spike in the development index of developing countries, with China, India, leading the pack. So what this says is that the economic profile of the developing world may have got a facelift, and that the no poverty and zero hunger goals of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has had some impact on the campaign against poverty. But the fact that COVID-19 could derail the campaign
Mm.
tells me that poverty is linked to something deeper than economics. COVID-19 has decelerated the pace of change, and we now risk reversing decades of progress. UN stats tell us that about 700 million people have to be dug out of extreme poverty.
Ah.
The achievement of the UN goals on no poverty and zero hunger is obviously under considerable threat.
Mhm.
Oxfam has been calling on world leaders to agree on emergency rescue package of US dollars 2.5 trillion, paid for through the immediate cancellation or postponement of 1 trillion in debt repayments, a
Mhm.
$1 trillion increase in the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights, and an additional 500 billion in aid.
Mhm.
Now, I don't want to dampen any optimism, but at the end of the 20th century, developing nations had passed around their hats for development funds, but funding, uh, uh, funding by the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund,
Mhm.
probably made veteran borders of these nations at the time.
Mhm.
The Colombo plans, poverty summits, Commonwealth conferences, and non-aligned movements may have got underway, but were not able to do anything in a significant way to alleviate the developing world's chronic problems with poverty. Neither did the experiments with social governance nor capitalist doctrines do anything to change the destiny of those people in the margins. So, what is it that can lift the less developed world from poverty? That is something I examine in this book, along with the other socio-political conundrums that challenge our ever-changing planet. I believe there is a more sustainable approach to ending poverty in a way that would make the world resilient to future natural disasters, which push people back into poverty.
Mhm.
You see, COVID-19 did not really devastate high and middle income populations. It hit the world's poorest in
Mhm.
developing countries, where the social climate in which economic development can germinate has not yet been prepared. So that is something to think about, and that is what I expressed in this book. And I will share those insights later on in this conversation with you.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, let's talk about migration and refugees, one of the other current groups. It's an issue that Western societies are divided on and some troubled by it. It's very obvious that new challenges to Western societies in our time, including the need for steady growth of their populations and the imperative to compete with world production to boost their economies, have prompted them to look for manpower skills through immigration. But it's a foregone conclusion that immigration is both an opportunity and a challenge.
Mhm.
So, in the late 19th and earlier 20th century, North America turned to Britain and Europe for manpower to develop an agrarian economy, as well as to build their country's infrastructure, of course. Canada resisted arrivals of the Chinese, the Japanese, and the East Indians following protests from white residents. But in the late 20th century, the migration pattern was upended. The current global estimate is that there were around 272 million international migrants in the world in 2019, which accounts for about 3.5% of the global population. Now, the United States, of course, has been the number one country of destination for international migrants since about 1970. But the number of foreign-born people residing in the US now is more than quadrupled, from less than 12 million in 1970 to close to 51 million in 2019. The International Organization for Migration says that more than 40% of all international migrants worldwide come from Asia. Now, global migration and mobility are today at the heart of global change, creating vibrant economic development, but also challenging social and political inclusion, religious diversity, and blind nationalist sentiment. This indeed is global transformation, and there are calls on governments to review policy in the light of these new troubles. Now, you cannot talk about migration without a reference to race and religion. I examined the race and religion issue within the context of migration in my book, but with a Canadian perspective. Canada's early history has been stained by stories of prejudiced treaties with the First Nations, as well as by those ugly Anglo-French battles and race-driven legislation introduced to bar the entry into Canada of the Japanese, the Chinese, and East Indian communities. But the nation has made amends. Its charter guarantees rights and freedoms to all Canadians, regardless of race or faith. And so Canada is truly becoming a template for the model state. Its policymakers recognize that immigration is about economics, not altruism. But they also realize that multiculturalism is a work in progress. There must be a sense of one's common humanity, despite the diversity of our cultures. And therefore, in the new milieu, the country's city planners have been brought into the process of creating multicultural cities. The political scientist, Professor Sohail Inayatullah, tells me that historically the image of the city has gone from the city beautiful, focused on parklands and clean streets, to the city ecological. This is the high-tech city, or what he now calls the smart city. The city that senses and thinks, that can monitor the needs of its citizens. When trees are about to interfere with power lines, when criminals are about to loot a store. So Geneva, he says, has taken a different tack. What was once a classical, traditionally white Euro city has in the last 30 or 40 years transformed beyond belief. And this I have seen. Cafes lined with African, Middle Eastern, Indian, Italian, and fast food restaurants, and public life one sees, and in public life out there, one sees a slew of cultures mixing. Professor Inayatullah calls for the designing of cities where spaces are not segregated by race or gender. One should not be able to identify an ethnic area or ethnic enclaves or ghettos, as they call them as well. Or at least one should not see them in a negative way. Second, he says citizens should feel that they're part of the city, that they're not discriminated against, especially by those in authority. The multicultural city is also about incorporating other ways of knowing, creating a complex and chaotic model of space, such that the city does not necessarily match the values of only one culture. Mosques were temples and banks. City design not only done by trained city planners, but as well by feng shui experts, he says, searching for the energy lines. Now, the importance of religion as one aspect of diversity has also been recognized, and the need for concomitant research or policy capacity to address many of the issues that arise from religious diversity is being prioritized. That is because a clash of civilizations is inevitable. So as people of different faiths take up residence in the West, and that it will happen because immigration spurs economic growth, The challenge of accommodating religious diversity, especially within the framework of secular governance, gets more pointed, gets more challenging. So in my book, I roll out the narrative on how Canada is challenged by religious diversity, especially with calls from Hindu disciples for a waterway to immerse the ashes of the deceased, as well as calls from Muslims to include the Sharia law in Canada's penal code. So you see, as Canada's pluralism gets deep-seated, the challenge will be greater. I say greater because I believe public opinion surveys reveal that relations between faith communities and secular Canadians are now a very important preoccupation. But no one can ignore the fact that growing immigration is a growing sign of economic and cultural dynamism. So there is a significant demographic change in the world, characterized by considerable growth in the percentage of Westerners who are not Christian, as well as an increase in Westerners reporting no religion. There is already evidence of an exponential growth in religions from South and East Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. But the hundreds of thousands of newcomers that are headed to countries in the West every year are not going to leave their religion at the door and come in. That's because culture at its heart is religious. Yes, so Europe too has its share of troubles with migration and the flow of refugees. In the 21st century, nationalistic culture again took root on European soil as the waves of migrants billowed and racial prejudice got deep-seated. If you recall, in 2011, Norwegian terrorist Anders Behring Breivik, in a shooting and bombing rampage, murdered some 92 people. He said that he did this because the number of Muslims in Western Europe was reaching critical mass, and that there is a core of cultural communist elites in Western Europe who really want to destroy Western civilization, European traditions, national solidarity, and Christianity. Breivik, of course, portrayed himself as a modern-day crusader, fighting against what he saw as the Islamic invasion of Europe. A sinister side to this racist culture has been unfolding since the early decade of the 21st century, rolling back globalization. That was evident in the Brexit call to take over control and Donald Trump's mantra of making America great again.
Yeah.
I guess I thought you'd think that was a laughing matter, yeah.
Yeah.
So the emergence of populists and demagogues, especially in Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States, impacted on global society, and that was scary. In his campaign, Trump promised to bar the entry of Muslims, build a wall to stop the Mexicans whom he allegedly accused of being rapists and druggies, and to immediately terminate President Obama's executive amnesties so as to put America first. Now, his campaign had already found favor with the Dutch politician Geert Wilders, who had set out proposals ahead of the 2017 elections in the Netherlands, which included banning immigrants from Islamic countries and closing mosques, Islamic schools, and asylum centers. A row over France's crackdown on Roma migrants from Romania and Bulgaria dominated the summit of EU leaders in Brussels some years ago. President Nicolas Sarkozy, I think, was furious after Justice Commissioner Viviane Reding appeared to compare France's removal of Roma people with gypsy deportations during World War II. She compared France's actions to the persecution of Jews and gypsies in Nazi-occupied France when she said, "This is a situation I have thought Europe would never have to witness again after the Second World War." And then at the end of 2015, the world sat up and took notice again. Alan Kurdi, the Syrian child fleeing the country's war, was dead on a shore in Europe after a migrant boat capsized. World leaders were stunned and compassion burst open the floodgates to a migrant flow in Europe, unprecedented since World War II. And that appeared like a moment, actually, of truth when the world was putting aside prejudice in the race to save masses of humanity. The tragedy, I think, pulled at the hearts of European leaders, led by Germany's Angela Merkel, who opened the country's border wide enough to take in at least 31,000 immigrants. Over the September 5 weekend. But in the midst of this crisis, Australia's former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, told European leaders that the way to stop the crisis was to stop the boats. Apart from that being an immoral immigration policy, it reflected an immature understanding of the gravity of this crisis. Later on, the weekend of September 20, Austria was challenged with the arrival of another 17,000 migrants. In their desperation, Hungarian forces resorted to tear gas to disperse the crowds. Hungary's populist Prime Minister Viktor Orban had claimed for months that Europe was being overrun by refugees who threatened to overwhelm its economy and security and alter its very culture and identity. Those arriving have been raised in another religion and represent a radically different culture. Most of them are not Christians, but Muslims, Mr. Orban wrote in a commentary for the German newspaper. So Hungary was indeed being urged to halt its campaign, portraying refugees as invaders. The Danish parliament, on the other hand, at the time, passed a package of measures to deter refugees from seeking asylum, including confiscating valuables to pay for their stay, despite protests from international human rights organizations. The bill, which allowed the confiscation of refugees' cash exceeding 10,000 kroner, had prompted comparisons to Nazi Germany's confiscation of the personal possessions of Jews in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Is a record 1.3 million migrants applied for asylum in the 28 member states of the European Union, Norway, and Switzerland in 2015. Europe was convulsed with this flow of immigrants, which pushed European states to take divisive positions on the refugee policy, resulting in some closing borders with far-right European political movements, promoting distrust of Muslims and white national conspiracy theorists, predicting a Muslim takeover of Europe. You see, that is why I brought in migration and the race and religion connection, because I think in the West, and especially in Europe, this is a troublesome area. Don't you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you had, not to be crude, but if you had a large population of white Protestants or Roman Catholics knocking on the door because of some emergency that needed to be taken in, I suspect they'd be taken in. So I agree, it is race and religion. And I think at the most basic level, I think it's because people are afraid of people they don't understand. They know if somebody's different, different in quotation marks. Obviously, we're all alike. We're all human. But they don't understand the religion. They don't understand the family. They don't understand how they have social interaction. And they're afraid, which is bizarre. Instead of being afraid, what we should be doing is saying, welcome, we'd like to learn about you, and you can learn about us. But that is obviously not what happens.
It's not what happens,
Not at all.
And you can see that host communities are basically feeling threatened. That their culture is going to erode, that Christianity shall, probably just be eradicated or something of that sort. These are fears. Simply because one isn't able to understand the other. And in the 21st century, that's something somewhat kind of ridiculous, you know.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
so, so then I
Here,
say, sorry.
I'm sorry. Here on the nightly news, we see people trying to come up from South America and Mexico. People that are so desperate, they have nothing, and you know, there is no welcome.
Yeah.
It breaks everyone's heart, but you know, the individual can't do very much. You can help some people, but it's just a sad situation.
Indeed, Angela Merkel, I think, was living her faith as German Chancellor. I mean, she realized that she would probably have to get out of power,
Hmm.
but the way she was handling the flow of refugees into Germany, I mean,
Hmm.
she stopped at nothing. She just opened her gates wide, you know,
Hmm.
and that I think makes her a senior statesman, you know, one with compassion.
Yes.
Be able to see that there are pockets of the world in desperation at this time.
Yes. Yes.
And you know,
Hmm.
uh, I remember the scriptural line that says, "To whom much is given, much
Hmm.
much is expected."
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Oh.
yeah. So then I go on to say, how does a country then accommodate religious diversity and welcome an intellectual workforce of diverse cultures in a secular framework of governance? We need skills, and these
Hmm.
skills can only come from outside the country.
Hmm.
In Canada, for example, the net growth in population comes from immigration. The net
Hmm.
growth. And you need populations basically to bump up the economy, to
Yeah.
tax base, you know, to increase consumption and things like that. And so they're aware of the realities of, a slumping economy uh, that becomes the natural course of events when population figures are down, uh, economy figures are down. You know.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
any case, so there are these questions that come up. How do we grow multicultural cities? What is the challenge that social inclusion or exclusion
Hmm.
poses? How do we police in a multicultural society? What's the nature of identity politics? You know, the wearing of the turban, or
Hmm.
carrying of the kippah with you, the dress of the Muslim woman, called the hijab and such.
Hmm.
I mean, they naturally don't leave these at the door and come in. So how do you accommodate this interest of keeping the economy stable? So Canada recognized, I cast a light on those and several other conundrums that challenge migrant recipient countries. Now, Canada recognizes the new challenge that it's up against, and that religious diversity is intrinsically part of the package that multiculturalism brings. Now, in 2011, 2.4 million people identified themselves as either Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, or Buddhist, accounting for 7.2% of Canada's population.
Hmm.
So more specifically, slightly over 1 million individuals identified themselves as Muslim,
Hmm.
making up 3.2% of the national population.
Hmm.
Uh, let's now talk about the threat of war. You
Hmm.
know, you have a question
No.
that comes
I.
up.
Mm-mm.
All right. So as we speak, the cannonballs are flying over Ukraine.
Oh.
I mean, and that line echoes Bob Dylan's wail crying out, saying, "How many times should the cannonballs fly
Yeah.
before they're forever banned?" So
Hmm.
in 1945, when those deadly guns of World War II fell
Yeah.
silent, the world stopped to think and collectively said, "Never again." But some memories are short-lived.
Hmm.
Uh, a couple of years ago, the former American President Donald Trump, sorry to bring him up again, and his counterpart in North Korea were saber-rattling, flinging threats of a nuclear confrontation.
Mhm.
Now, analysts observing developments in the Russian-Ukrainian war are
Yeah.
also talking about the possible escalation,
Mhm.
of this war to dangerous thresholds.
Oh yeah, definitely.
What has the world been doing about it? The formation of the League of Nations after World War One may have been a great start to keep the peace, providing deterrence to escalation of conflict. But its limited mandate put a cap on its powers of intervention, and so it was dismantled unceremoniously as World War II descended upon us. The formation of the United Nations was a brave initiative, but it's a world body that's also incapacitated by its mandate, and which is why there have been calls for UN reform. Uh,
Mhm.
it has been criticized for being an exclusive nuclear club with five nuclear powers calling the shots. And a consequence of that structure is that a veto from any one of the permanent members can halt any possible action the UN Security Council may take. So, its peacekeeping forces were never mandated to deter war.
Mhm.
Instead, they were mandated to monitor peace uh, after the signing of peace treaties. NATO has been able to flex its muscles and stop wars, but it's not a world body. It's a big boys club mandated to protect the borders of most European and the two countries in North America now, the United
Mhm.
States and Canada. So, what are the safeguards that the world body really can rustle up today to challenge the inevitability of war and secure the world from that terrible eventuality of a handful of world leaders setting the world on fire?
Yeah.
What are the options? Is a reformed and restructured United Nations going to fortify the world body? Do we need a world army with the muscle to deter and stop a war, intervening when any of the world's 195 nations is threatened? I don't exactly know. What I do know is darkness cannot drive away darkness. Light can do that. In this book, I share some light with two scenarios to open up the conversation.
Mhm.
It takes the courage to dream of the day when war will be relegated to the back pages of history and bring about radical change in the way mankind's reason and heart evolves to challenge war with peace. Uh, Lastly, let's examine national morality. In this chapter, I argue that in almost all cases, citizens of a state have definite traits of national character, which bring them together as one people bonded by a set of spiritual beliefs, customs, traditions, and linguistic commonality. And that it's this commonality of national character that promotes a sense of nationhood. What we have also come to realize is that morality is central to the spirit of nations, which is
Mhm.
why many nations are theocracies. It may also be fair to say that a decline in morality can affect the prosperity of nations. The curious question that this conversation raises, however, is what moral decline am I talking about? I take national morality as being, one of the conundrums of life today on the planet. Um, so I'm talking about what moral decline am I, talking about? I'm talking about the dramatic leap forward to rebellion against restraint in the second half of the 20th century, when countries, especially the West, were stumbling out of post-war depression. I'm
Mhm.
talking about the careless drift to licentiousness and godlessness, the plunge into hedonism, the seeking of gratification from the abuse of alcohol, drugs, promiscuity, and violence. Um, I know most young teenagers today are taught to navigate the waters of life through power, wealth, and fame. A soccer star might rank first among some of their heroes, and God might just be dismissed as an idea. The
Mhm.
perpetuating notion that man is master of his faith and captor of his soul is really scary. The atheist community has long held the notion that morality is driven by the natural order of human consciousness. It's commonly assumed that people act in ways that are dictated by a moral obligation and that morality commits us to that social consciousness. What this says is that the world can be moral without God. I respond to that notion drawing on a piece of European history which outlines the immorality of the age prior to the Edict of Milan in 313, and the narrative of how Christian societal reform
Mhm.
changed the order of the era, kicking out slavery and infanticide from the immoral fabric of nations. It's no secret that we see a trend to godlessness as well,
Mhm.
significant section of our society, driven by a notion that the universe created itself some 14 billion years ago. So I addressed this in my earlier book, Science and the God Illusion, which I released in 2019. And I
Mhm.
present a brief response to that doctrine in this book as well. The chapter carries a brief narrative on the Big Bang and the skepticism with which the theory was received by a section of the scientific world. I also present Charles Darwin's admission in the final edition of his book,
Mhm.
Origin of Species, that life forms were first breathed by the Creator.
Mhm.
I suspect that fact is known to merely a few of those who have read his first editions,
Right.
because he brought this out in his very last sixth edition.
Mhm.
I suspect the fact is known to just, frankly, merely a few of those who read his first editions. I also addressed the questions that finally ended the euphoria over the Miller-Urey experiment in 1953, which sought scientific confirmation that life could have evolved with the serendipity of amino acids joining together in thousands of units to form proteins, which could have combined into symbiotic relationships, which we refer to as life. The eminent scientist, Dr. Gerald Schroeder, author of the book The Hidden Face of God, referred to that scientific inquiry as one long study in failure. Um, Now, I bring this up in greater detail in the book because we know that godlessness, prevails because of the confusion among societies uh, that the universe did in fact, create itself, and that man was formed in the primordial ocean. A lot of serendipity in all of that. And so that's where we are. So the defining question, however, talking about morality, is how does moral decline affect national life and economic progress? I have given that question a whirl as well in my book, Global Healing. This is a condensed version of what the book is about. The greater detail, of course, is all in the book. So, what are those thoughts that I bring to the table to address these conundrums and usher in change? You see, a nuclear war will bring the world to its knees, and civilization will be a faint idea for those who inherit the earth. That's not the world we want to have or
No.
leave behind for our grandkids, do we?
Mhm.
History will hold us up in contempt. So we must brace for change. The scourge of poverty, religion, and the threat of war have troubled our world for centuries, shedding blood, sweat, and tears along the expanse of war is ugly, and its progenitors belong outside the bounds of civilization. So what this book has sought to do is bring brilliant minds to the table to examine the nature of whatever enslaves us to a future that's doomed, and probably review the options at hand that can bring about change, even at the cost of going back to the drawing board to dream up new ways of making life civilized and subsequently sustainable.
Mhm.
In 1997, I wrote the book Can the Poor Inherit the Earth? I was driven by the notion at that time that poverty is not necessarily a problem beset bad economics. In my research, I examined the Japanese miracle, its resurgence from the ashes of World War II,
Mm-hmm.
a mystifying genie that enabled Japan to overtake the developed world after that demoralizing defeat was Japan's commitment to develop widespread education, for the creation of a well-educated workforce that would be foundational to the country's technological advancement. The country's super high rate of literacy at 99% today is credited to be key to its emergence as an economic juggernaut,
Mm-hmm.
ranks third in the world economy now after the US and China. Like John Kenneth Galbraith, the eminent American economist, I was fascinated too with how China was evolving with the principle of the people's commune, a three-tier system of grassroots participation in economic development, with China's adult literacy rate climbing up to 99.8% in 2018. Its poverty rate fell from 88% in 1981 to 0.7% in 2015.
Wow.
Its GDP is now second only to the United States of America. In the
Mhm.
book, I bring up examples to point to the what do you call it? The concomitants between literacy and poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Poverty is not a problem in itself. The fact remains that unless we create an environment and a climate, a social climate in which literacy and economic development can germinate, we cannot end poverty. Okay, that's essentially what I bring to this to the table.
Mm-hmm.
I study the factors driving economic failures in Africa. Geographers point out that the roots of Africa's food crisis are manifold: climate change, deforestation, and social erosion. Its famines and food shortages are often regarded as a product of drought. But even in the absence of drought, Africa has experienced hunger. Sub-Saharan Africa has millions of hectares of fertile soil. The continent can feed itself. What's the secret that can change Africa's destiny? Seen from an academic lens, the consistent 2% drop in food production per year and the 3% growth in population since the 60s reflects Africa's real problems with feeding itself. So, how do you achieve an equivalency in the growth rates of population and the drop in food production? I believe you can achieve that balance by creating the social and cultural climate in which literacy and consequently economic development can germinate. A spike in literacy will lower population growth and consequently lower the poverty rate.
Mm-hmm.
I also carefully watched India's experiment with capitalism at the end of the last century. So evidence of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer.
Mm-hmm.
And I was convinced that, let me repeat, poverty is not necessarily driven by bad economics. I came up with the notion that you cannot eradicate poverty with gross domestic product growth unless you first prepare the social climate in which prosperity can mushroom.
Mm-hmm.
It's not chicken and egg question. Social change leads you to the point when you're ready to fire up prosperity. And what do I mean by social change? I speak of a climate in which literacy flourishes and civilized thought drives the engines of the nation. In 1961, India's literacy rate hovered at around 40%, according to the Census of India report. At about the same time, the Indian government estimated that poverty rate remained generally constant at 41%. 40% literacy, 41% poverty. Notice the concomitants between literacy and poverty. Then in 2018, India's National Statistics Commission affirmed that India's literacy rate had shot up to 77.7%. And the UN agency was reporting at the same time poverty had dropped significantly to 6.7%.
Hmm.
Spike in literacy forces a drop in the poverty rate.
You made a very important point there. When you're talking about literacy, and you also said something about a civilized way of people treating each other. I think those two things probably go together.
Yes.
And when you think of how uncivilized people act towards each other, I mean, just in the killing of unborn babies, or in the killing of the old or the sick in this country, I don't know in others, but the lack of wanting to be engaged with people of other races or other social classes. I mean, it's like we are a civilization that is not civilized.
Absolutely.
That is,
Absolutely, yes.
Yes.
In the book, I do say this. I mean, we take pro-life positions,
Mm-hmm.
but we uphold capital punishment.
Yeah.
Okay, we scorn
Yeah.
at the killings between tribes in Africa.
Yeah.
But we carry guns to defend ourselves.
Yes.
You see, so what is civilization about, really?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and so these are my thoughts. And as you said, that on the one hand, literacy, and on the other hand, civilization. You see that as I finish this in a few minutes, I ultimately make the point that education is key.
Oh, yes.
To resolving all of these conundrums that we've talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I say the key to development is dependent on so many non-economic factors that hinder economic progress, among which are quaint social beliefs, communal passion, religious heterogeneity, political conditions, and most of all, an appallingly high rate of illiteracy. So in my mind, I say, I can point to only education as the key to creating an ideal world. Iraqi booksellers who leave their books out in the open in the night have a saying, our readers do not steal and thieves cannot read.
Yeah.
So what this says to me is we create readers. We also get rid of thieves. We can create elite societies and peaceable communities by introducing moral conduct in the curricular of school education. A well-rounded education is key to the challenge of change. Academic literacy eliminates poverty by engaging societies in economic development. It moderates migration and the movement of people outside their national borders, because in literate societies, the jobs are in the home country. It scorns race-driven prejudice and dispels ignorance, which is the foundation of race-driven hate. Likewise, moral literacy creates a society that abhors violence and the scourge of war, and creates the climate in which nations are transformed and driven to spawn and engender peaceful generations. Education fosters national morality. If morality is made the cornerstone of education, of the education process, from the cradle upwards, across the world, education will shape moral character and may just be central to resolving some of the world's chronic problems, including troubles with poverty, migration worries, race and religion, the threat of war, and national morality. I do realize that Western nations may have got a head start with an education culture, but education must be custom designed to tackle the challenges of the day. The challenges I can see I see can be addressed if morality is made the cornerstone of the education process. I also realize that while Western nations may have got a head start with education, less developed nations were left behind. That does not work to change the destinies of the global population. There are 100 babies being born today, every day, at least 80 are from the developing nations. If we do not give them, the kids, the skills, the ABCs to empower themselves, the burden of life will ultimately impact on all of us.
Yeah.
And you can see that with how migration is, in fact, a burden on most of Europe
Mm-hmm.
and most of the West. Education is not merely an economic development agent, but a character builder, a morality progenitor, a virtue-driven engine, a peace broker, a literary agent, a tool that can end poverty, lower the unbridled growth of populations, instill abhorrence for violence, and deem it a dirty word, an engagement with the uncivilized. This is not a quick fix.
Mm-hmm.
Starting from the drawing board, the process of education and the reform of morality might take a decade or two for us to taste the first fruits of the Garden of Eden. But for a world that's longing for change,
Yeah.
a decade is like an evening gone.
That's
Yeah, that's
boy, going back to the Garden of Eden. That's, preferably before the fall. But but really, it's, you've really hit upon something here. I'd never really thought of literacy as being the answer.
Just about every conundrum
Yeah.
that challenges the world today.
Mm-hmm. I like it.
Come to Canada and see for yourself. The fact that most Canadians are at peace with one another.
Mm-hmm.
You see, it tells you that education really can provide the factors of peace. Everybody is basically nice to one
another. I wish I could say that here. So here we have a very different situation because people think they're educated. People graduate from grammar school, junior high, high school, and yet I'll get some people in a class, an undergraduate class, and it's like they can barely read. And it's like, I don't understand how you can go through 12 years of education and no one said, gee, you can't read.
Which is why I kind of clarified and I said, yes, you may have got a head start to education in the West, but that really must be custom made to resolve the problems of our day.
Yeah. So a very, very high rate of the population here is, I don't know if I'd necessarily say illiterate, but close to it. And that leads to a world of ills.
A world of ills. That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
I mean, how can you speak of being a civilized society? Very frankly, if but let's not go there. I said it once. Don't want to repeat myself.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of contradictions in human behavior, which you do not expect to come from educated minds. So
yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I just thought to leave you with these thoughts, and
well, I hope that many people buy this book because I think that it can have an impact on people.
Thank you. Although I think the target group, that this book aims at, are not just about every book lover or every just reader, the average reader on the street, simply because it also calls for involvement from stakeholders. I, for example, would like this book to get into the hands of people in the different bodies of the United Nations, UNESCO especially, because if we're going to make literacy the focus of a campaign that's seeking to change the world with a solid, what's it called? With a design on education
where they can have some
bring about
influence.
all of this. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
So let's see. The target group is a slightly different one, and of course, I think every intellect really seeking answers to the problems of today will probably be keen to check it out, because, like you said, you didn't think literacy was at the heart of some of these problems.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The creation of literate societies, educated societies. Yeah.
Well, that's I hate to say this, but it's like a revolutionary idea, and it shouldn't be. I can't believe why I never thought of this before.
I'm happy you say so. Yes, because it was in the making for quite a while. I mean, this has been my pet subject since 1997 when I launched the book "Can the Poor Rent the Earth?" The thing with this book is, whereas in the book I brought out in 1997, I talked about literacy as key in eradicating poverty. But revisiting the book, I see that literacy is key to dealing with some of these major conflicts that trouble the world today.
Yeah, and they trouble the whole world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No man is an island, and therefore I say, if we're not going to be bothered about what's going on in the less developed countries, if we're not going to take the initiative to eradicate illiteracy, the burden of it all will fall upon all of us. And as we see out there in the Europe and in North America, that burden is already witnessed.
Yeah. I agree. Well, that's impressive. It's impressive thinking. And yeah, it is. And I think, I think you might really have a solution here.
I'm just hoping that my readers would have the capacity to think like you have just now, and respond to it likewise. Yeah.
Well, we'll certainly hope for that and pray for it.
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, that's good work. I mean, there's just no other way of putting it.
Oh, thank you.
Fine work.
Thank you, Cynthia.
You're welcome. Well, thank you for giving me this interview. I found it to be a fascinating hour or so, eye-opening.
Yeah. I thought for a moment, though, and because I've had condensed so much of it into this hour-long presentation, the rolling out of facts and such sometimes can bore the reader, but I think the veteran reader would realize that stats in itself create a picture.
Yes, they do.
And so I had to bring it in here and there, and I was trying very hard to make sure that I wasn't boring you.
Oh, no, not at all.
Then, as I was saying to my wife, you need to set the stage before you come up with thoughts that you
Yeah.
know have later.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, very good. I hope it gets into the hands of many people who are thinkers, and I hope it gets into the hands of the people that have some power to do something. But even, when you think of people teaching in a university, something, just to get that idea across, it's I don't know why it's so unique. I should have thought of that already.
Yes, which is why I have stayed with the notion and expanded it. And this was the other thing. In my career, I mean, I was fortunate to travel across the world as a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
And in most of my travels, I keenly observed this formula, shaping up. The less literate the state, the greater the poverty.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. And so these were observations, and the fact remains that between the time I wrote "Can the Poor Inherit the Earth" and today, we've seen that doctrine come true to be the truth. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you, Cynthia, for your time.
Oh, anytime.
And giving it your time to bring this across to others.
I think they'll be as impressed as I am. I certainly hope so.
Well, let's hope that happens. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, any closing thoughts before we close in prayer?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay.
I've taken up well more than an hour and 15 minutes of your time. Yeah.
That's all right. It was worth it.
Yeah.
It was definitely worth it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you like to close us in prayer?
Okay. Dear God, we thank you that we were able to share these thoughts on the state of our world in the hope that new thoughts and ideas going around people, influencers, will strike a note somewhere and change may result. Thank you, the Holy Spirit, for keeping us vigilant in this 1 hour. And we thank you, dear God, for bringing any wisdom that can alleviate poverty, eradicate violence and war, and bring peace to your world. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you again for the interview, and we'll keep in touch. If you have another book, make sure you get in touch, and we'll interview again.